1 year ago, I created a video essay titled In Defense of Homestuck's Ending. In said video, I made an argument that the comic Homestuck had an incredible ending that masterfully used the comic's themes of control over the narrative and the feeling of being trapped to create a beautiful ending. And I stand by that video. It's one of the best essays I've ever written. But, to be honest, there was a bit of rhetorical sleight of hand that I employed in that video. I made it very clear at the start of that video that it was focused almost exclusively on Act 7, the Rapture, which is a good ending. But in doing so, I ignored the rest of Part 4, which ranges in quality from actually decent to infuriatingly bad. For a lot of people, it didn't matter what the ending said thematically, because they'd already given up on Homestuck. The later years of the comic weren't satisfying, and the ending didn't fix the problems the comic had been struggling with. Part 4 consists of Caliborn's chapters, which are funny and thematically important, but also drag a lot. 2 chapters dedicated to setting up a Jenga tower. Then we get Game Over, an animation which is the equivalent of chucking a brick at the aforementioned Jenga tower. Fix This, which is actually a really good chapter until the final moments. She's Back, a chapter that I will talk about later. Collide, which is cool, but also very obviously just Hussey quickly tying up loose ends. And then the Rapture and the credits. Part 4 is rough. Brilliant at times, but also often infuriating. For a lot of people, it killed the comic. But as someone who actually likes Part 4 more than most people, I don't think Part 4 is what killed the comic. The comic didn't suddenly get bad in 2015. And it didn't get bad in 2011 either, Act 6 haters. I think after rereading some of the later Homestuck chapters, I get why the comic died. And before I explain how, I first need to discuss a few characters. There are 6 suspects that I need to talk about, and I think that if I do, by the end of this video, we will understand what killed Homestuck. You know who's weird? Jack Noir. He's the main antagonist for the first half of the comic, but he never talks. Homestuck is a very, very dialogue-heavy comic. 11 different characters have more than 20,000 words of dialogue. John, Dave, and Carcat all have more than 50,000. But Jack Noir only talks once. There are a few times when the narration explains his thoughts, but seriously, Jack Noir only talks in one specific segment. He also isn't a very deep character. Like, I can rant for hours about the personalities and character arcs of Caliborn or Vriska, but there isn't much to say about Jack as a person. He's petty, violent, and hateful. He's silly, sometimes, but most of the time he's a cold, silent killer. He's nice to Jade after absorbing Beck's powers, but that isn't his personality, it's Beck's. All he does is destroy. I use the plugin Homestuck POV Cam a lot when rereading for this video. Special thanks to Madman Bob and 6th Hokage 1, by the way. And rereading the comic from Jack's perspective is wild. It brings you through the best parts of the comic through an endless parade of violence. To recap, because I forgot some of these, in order, Jack kills and or destroys the Black Queen, the Black King, all of WV's army, most of Prospit, Prospit's moon and thus Jade, Dave's bro and almost Dave's sprite, almost John via the planet as he sets on fire. John successfully this time. Dave, John's dad and Rose's mom. John again. Rose, the mayor's boat. Dave again. Multiple frogs. Droll. The White King and Queen. The aimless renegade. Almost the mayor. An army of Arrhenius. Troll Prospect and all of the Prospect trolls but Vriska. Troll Durst and all the Durst trolls. And then finally the entire human universe. During this rampage, he stops only to reward PM, trophy binge, and save Jade. All Jack does is kill because he likes killing. In a comic defined by complex characters, Jack Noir is surprisingly two-dimensional. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think Jack is an effective villain. He embodies this ever-present sense of dread that makes He Is Already Here excellent. He doesn't have an arc, but he forces other characters to have arcs. He keeps the plot advancing and creates some truly incredible moments. John doing the windy thing, Dave finding Bro's corpse, PM emerging at the end of Cascade, Jade saving John as Prospect crashes, Vriska's coin flip, John, Jade, and Iradia's god tier rebirths. All of these things happen because of Jack Noir. Carcat is right. Jack isn't a person. He's cancer. He's a natural disaster. He's the living embodiment of the danger that Spurb brings. Jack Noir is essential for those themes of survival and being trapped that I talked about last year. Like, I enjoy Lord English as a concept. He's a more complex character than Jack, definitely, but he doesn't work as well as Jack because he isn't personally slaughtering the cast. Cascade is Jack's swan song, showing his brutality, his relationship with Jade, and ending with him meeting his match. And then after Cascade, Jack doesn't do anything. I mean, he duels PM for 3 years, forms a crush on her, is horrified by Lord English, has a quick fight with John that ends in a draw, kills Dave in Game Over, and is finally defeated in Collide, but that isn't the point. Jack's role in the comic is basically over after Cascade. He pops up from time to time, but his impact on the plot is small. His fight with PM could have happened at the end of Part 2, with minimal changes to the rest of the comic. Jack exposes a writing flaw that Homestuck suffers from a lot, an inability to tie up plot threads. Hussey didn't get rid of Jack when he was relevant, so he stuck around until Collide, when all of the loose plot points were hastily crossed out. And the thing is, Jack doesn't die in Collide. I genuinely remember that wrong for years. Jack is still alive at the end of the comic. PM and Jade spare him because reasons. And the last thing we see is Miss Paint bandaging his severed arm. Now, I said there was a part of Homestuck where Jack talks, and that part is in the Snapchat mini-arc that came out after the comic ended. This arc is dubiously canon. Scratch that. It's dubiously canon to the dubiously canon, but I think it's intended to be canon to that canon. Jane's descent into authoritarianism is set up, which from what I've heard is a plot point in the epilogues. Anyway, in these Snapchats, Jack recruits the Felt to help him kill Jane and Roxy. He is defeated and forced to work for Jane as a slave. As far as I know, this plot point is not followed up on in the dubiously canon continuity. Anyway, Jack talks. He talks like an old-timey gangster. I mean, I guess that makes sense. He's the same person as Spade Slick, basically. But that hit me like a truck full of bricks when I read it. This vitally important character, in a comic where diction is so important, has a diction I never imagined. That's all I have to say about Jack Noir. Let's talk about someone else. Vriska Circuit is a very well-written character. That shouldn't be interpreted as me saying she's a good person, because holy shit, she is not. God damn. Rereading all of Vriska's pages, I realized I'd forgotten how incredibly fucked up her treatment of Tavros is. Remember when she paralyzed him and then installed a bunch of staircases in his house and then made him apologize for being paralyzed? God damn, that was fucked up. And the kiss scene and the kill scene and killing him, she is horribly, horribly abusive to him. To say nothing of forcing Solix to kill Aradia or blinding Terezi. Vriska did not do nothing wrong. She did all of the wrong things. All of them. And yes, she had a shitty childhood, but who gives a shit? Dave had an abusive childhood, and I don't see him acting abusive and ableist. Vriska sucks. But that doesn't mean she isn't an excellent character. Vriska steals every scene featuring her. Her arrogance, snappy comments, and absurd levels of cruelty make her conversations among the best in the comic. Vriska is a character you love to hate. Vriska created endless fandom arguments because she's a complex and entertaining character. Moreover, Vriska has a really solid character arc. Vriska is obsessed with being in control. All of her interactions with other characters, even the somewhat friendly ones she has with John, are about her controlling other people. She constantly makes overcomplicated plans and carries out horrible acts of violence so she can be in control. This is very fitting considering her mind control powers and spider motif. When she becomes a god, she gains what she's always wanted, control over fate. Honestly, if I were to psychoanalyze her, I'd speculate Vriska's need to be in charge stems from her abusive, overbearing childhood. When Jack shows up, Vriska changes slightly from wanting to control other people to also wanting to control the story. Homestuck is, at its deepest level, about different characters fighting for control over the narrative, and Vriska is the first to try and take control of the story. She finds out about destined tragedies and deliberately causes them so she'll be more important to the story. Jack can't be stopped, he's already here, but Vriska decides she'll be the one to create him, because that will make her a more vital part of the narrative. She reshapes the story so she'll be the protagonist. So it'll end with a climactic duel between her and Jack Noir. Honestly, the character who I'd argue is the most similar to Vriska is Caliborn. Vriska saw the world was a story and decided to control things by being the savior of everything, while Caliborn sought to take control as the unbeatable ultimate villain. They're two sides of the same coin, the boy who wants to be the monster and the girl who needs to be the hero. And to give the character a hint of sympathy, she really needs to be that hero. Vriska isn't completely heartless. She regrets killing Tavros. She understands that she isn't a good person. She latches on to this idea that if she can kill Jack, it'll make things right. It'll erase her mistakes. If she can save the day, then she'll be the hero. As Act 5 nears its end, Vriska prepares to fight Jack Noir. Enter Terezi, her rival, her old friend, her victim. They make a bet. Terezi flips a coin. Head she lives, scratch she dies. Vriska takes this bet because it isn't a real bet. She's in control. She makes the coin land heads. She flies off for her destined fight, and Jack ignores her. He kills Karkat and Terezi. Vriska fights him, but we don't see how the fight ends, because Terezi takes back control. Vriska is not the hero. She's far too terrible to be anything other than the villain of someone else's story. And the hero of Vriska's story is Terezi. Terezi stabs Vriska in the back. She chooses to make her own decision, unbound by Vriska's meddling. Vriska dies, and it is just. By stabbing Vriska, Terezi takes away any chance she had at redemption. She doesn't get the big moment where she proves she's the hero. She doesn't slay the big bad wolf and live happily ever after as the savior of everyone. But the thing is, even if she fought Jack, she still wouldn't be the hero. Even if she had won, and Doc Scratch implies she would have, that wouldn't have made things right. How could it, when the people she was fighting to save were already dead by her hand? After Vriska's death, we get a few scenes to mourn her. Her final message to John, unread as she lies in a pool of her own blood, explains what I've already said, that she wants to make things right. Her date in the snow, with a version of John who doesn't remember her, is a bittersweet epilogue that is the closest thing to a happy ending she could get. And to be honest, this is where she should have been left. Her arc was finished, it was satisfying. Except, she kept appearing. Hussey proposes to her, more on that in a bit. She gets fused with Tavros, she fights Mina, and eventually, she becomes important to the story again. She leads John to the ultimate weapon. Her friends ditch her for being terrible, and John loses any affection he still had, but she remains important to the narrative. And as far as she's concerned, that makes her the hero. And this is weird, right? It's contrary to her previous arc. But whatever. Vriska barely appears after that. She goes on a few dates with Mina, during which she realizes that she's awful because she had to deal with Arena, who shares all of her worst traits. Okay, sure, this is Vriska's ending. She's happy with Mina, she's given up her obsession with control, she stopped being evil. It's a bit rushed and very, very dumb, but whatever. The comic is done with Vriska. Right? Oh no. Oh no, that's very, very bad. Oh no, 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 no. Anyway, before I talk about that, let's cut away to something else. Hey, remember when Vriska got pissed about a cutaway gag? That was funny, but also how the fuck did she notice that? This is the only scene where she has fourth wall awareness. Speaking of fourth wall awareness... Andrew Hussey is weird. Let me rephrase that. Andrew Hussie, the fictional character who appears within the comic written by the real Andrew Hussie, is weird. Orange Guy is weird. Andrew Hussie appears as a character within the comic, which isn't actually that weird. A lot of webcomics at the time did so. Originally, Hussie appeared primarily to give recaps and for random cutaway gags, in addition to being the comic's omniscient narrator. The cutaways kinda suck, but early on they were fairly rare. And Hussie's narration does provide excellent prose. The thing is, during the later pages of 5.2, they became an actual plot-relevant character. After Doc Scratch steals the role of narrator, the Handmaiden summons Hussie, and Hussie kills Doc Scratch! The author personally beats their best villain to death. A few chapters later, Lord English shows up at the recap mansion and kills Hussie, something that is very important to the themes of Caliborn taking control of the narrative, and also something that doesn't really matter at all. Like, Hussie continues narrating, and Caliborn doesn't take over until the start of Part 4. Dying in the comic doesn't really affect Hussie's ability to write Homestuck. Hell, it gives them more opportunities for random self-indulgent cameos. Look, in this one, they spend the $2 million from the Hiveswap Kickstarter to buy back the Ring of Life. Isn't that wacky? God, the idea of Andrew Hussie misappropriating millions in Kickstarter money is so ridiculous that it is hilarious. To be honest, the best appearances of Hussie the character are their conversations with Caliborn. They act as a good straight man, leading to some hilarious scenes that help develop Caliborn as a character. Beyond that, they help set up his conquering of the narrative. Caliborn writes Homestuck out of spite because Hussie played elevator music and made him hang out with Gamzee. The thing is, besides killing Doc Scratch and antagonizing Caliborn, Hussie doesn't really do much. And that's weird, right? If the story is about characters fighting for control over the narrative, why isn't the actual author more relevant to that fight? Their only appearances in Part 4, as far as I can remember, are creeping out Vriska and giving Lord English a thumbs down right before the rapture. The comic's ending is about John escaping this destined battle Hussie set out before him, but Hussie doesn't factor into that ending at all. And I don't know, I feel like that's weird. I think it makes sense thematically for Hussie to be the final boss. They're the one pulling the strings. They're the one who kills everyone. Even after being shot, they're in control of the story. But after a certain point, they just stop appearing. To be clear, I'm not saying I want this Hussie to be more relevant. I'm saying that it would be interesting if Cutaway Gag Hussie slowly became a serious villain. Them becoming angrier and angrier as characters don't act how they're supposed to. Like, maybe there could be an act where Hussie gets sick of the characters and kills them out of spite, then John saves them all by rewriting the narrative, and Hussie tries to force things back to the original plan. That would have been an interesting story, rather than Hussie just being an annoying character whose jokes fall flat. Another weird thing about Hussie is that the comic is inconsistent about whether or not they're omniscient. They call themselves omniscient, but they also claim to not know everything. One of those statements is a lie, and I don't know which. They get tricked by Doc Scratch, which is weird, because they're the ones who created Doc Scratch, and thus should know how Doc Scratch works. The conclusion that makes the most sense is that Hussie is just the comic's narrator, nothing more. Except they also consistently claim to be the comic's writer in the recaps. If Hussie is just another character within the story, a weirdo pretending to be the writer, then that's an important part of their characterization that the comic doesn't really explore. And it still leaves the real Hussie, not the orange guy, as the ultimate villain. Why am I making such a big deal out of this? Because the comic makes a big deal out of it. Half of the chapters in Part 4 are about this weird metatextual fight over the narrative. The ending, which I said was good last year, is about escaping this narrative. If the comic is going to spend so much time on being meta, at the expense of the character stories that, to be honest, are a much more meaningful part of the comic to the reader than the fight over the narrator ever was, then at the very least, the comic should properly capitalize on those themes. Here's my problem with Hussie. It feels like they should be more important. Lord English shooting them says they're important. The themes of the comic say they should be important. And they're a throwaway gag character that just isn't very funny. Also, they're a pedophile. Hey, what the fuck was that? Vriska's 13. Mina explicitly calls out Hussey for being a creep. Why on earth did Andrew Hussey create a self-insert character and have the main joke with them being that said character wants to fuck a child? That was fucking weird. Talking about Homestuck can be complicated because there are 4 different people named Jack Noir who are all basically the same character but with vastly different impacts on the plot. Jack Noir B1, aka Bec Noir or Dog Jack, is a black hole of destruction that the plot orbits around. Jack Noir B2, aka Jack English, aka Lord Jack, is a character who exists? His impact on the story is minimal. He tries and fails to kill Jane, ends up in jail, and recreates Jailbreak. Then he stares into Lil Cal's eyes and is possessed by Lord English. And like it's implied he's possessed because Calborn puts his soul into Cal when he's a child, but also Dirk traps Calborn's soul in the puppet during the masterpiece, which feels contradictory. He replaces his eyes with those of the puppet, kills Jake and Jane, and then is teleported to the Outer Ring, where he remains for all of Part 4 before being decapitated by Dave during Collide. The old Jack Noir worked because he was a constant threat. Jack English is powerful, sure, but he isn't a threat to the main characters, because he's always either in jail or too far away to do jack shit. And I'm left wondering, did this character need to exist? Like, Jack's a universal constant, but the universe C-Jack was killed off screen, and Jack A1 is never even mentioned. Jack being so powerful in B1 was an anomaly. When Jack English destroys Prospit, he looks like he'll be super important, except he never does anything except come back to die several years later. The jailbreak bit is funny, but it's also a pointless diversion that slows down the pacing of a comic that was already struggling with pacing problems. I'm singling out Jack English because he's a good encapsulation of some of the problems that occur throughout Homestuck. Pointless characters, irrelevant diversions, and subplots that go nowhere. And Jack isn't even the worst example of this. Most of the ancestors, all but 2 of the Dancestors, the Felt, the Troll Fusion Sprites, the Midnight Crew, I'm constantly left wondering why these characters needed to exist. What do they contribute to the plot, other than showing up, wasting time on their introductions, then never doing anything important? Like, as much as I love the first intermission, is its impact on the story enough to justify putting the rest of the comic on hold for hundreds of pages? I don't know if I can honestly say it is. There's this thing that Homestuck does a lot. Introduce more. More characters, more lore, more wacky stuff, and sometimes this works. It helped transform the comic into this complex, tangled web that's satisfying to untangle. Introducing the trolls was overall good for the comic. Among them are some of the comic's best characters. But like, half of the trolls are underdeveloped, and spending time introducing them just to kill them off tanked the comic's pacing. I think a lot of the time Hussey just introduced characters without having any idea what to do with them. And as we see with Jack English, sometimes the solution they came up with was absolutely nothing. The comic stopped doing this as much after Part 3, thankfully, and even mocked it a few times, but by then the comic was already overflowing with extraneous characters. And these extra plot threads just piled up because, as I explained previously, Hussey was bad at closing them. So by the end of the story, the comic needed Collide, because that was the only way to clean the slate so the comic could end. But that didn't fix the key issue. If you wanted more story on underdeveloped plot threads, well, they're dead now. The comic is over. Still, there's one thing worse than underdeveloped plot elements: ruining the comic's well-written ones. Let me just take a deep breath, take a sip of my water, make sure I don't destroy my throat. Okay, I'm good. The decision to revive Vriska was the worst goddamn writing decision in the entire comic. I hate this decision. I hate it because I like Vriska. Vriska is a good character. She had a good arc, and bringing her back undermines that arc. The whole point of Vriska is that she dies, that she isn't the hero, that she isn't in control, that she bleeds out as a punishment for her own actions because she's a terrible piece of shit. Vriska's death is one of the best pieces of writing in the entire comic. And then she just comes back and she's the hero now and she's in control of everything, and that's good, I guess. As if her being in control of everything wasn't the root of half of the problems the trolls dealt with. And also, why the hell are her plans so competent? Vriska is not good at scheming. Her plans blow up in her face all the time. Literally, at one point. And also, seeing Vriska explain a plan and then that plan going perfectly is kind of boring. Also, why is Vriska so good? Why does sparing her make her a kind person, while killing her leaves her as the same shitty person? Oh, and I just love the implication that Terezi was wrong for killing Vriska, that she's a fuck-up who did the wrong thing and should do whatever Vriska says. Except, Vriska only comes back because Terezi's the most competent character in the damn comic. Killing Vriska was a key moment in Terezi's development, it was an amazing scene, and now it's gone. Literally, it didn't happen. None of the stuff on the meteor happened anymore, so what was the point of all that? Oh, but don't worry, Vriska fixed all the meteor crew's problems, so everything's cool now, because she's so smart and cool, and actually she's the hero. The idea of John rewriting the comic is good, and plays into the themes of the story. I like John undoing Game Over, but reviving Vriska is contrary to the comic's themes. If John had appeared right before Game Over and fixed things, that could work. Going back so far just throws away hundreds of pages of character development, making it all feel pointless. Removing the defining moment of Vriska's arc ruins Vriska as a character. I really, really do not like this plot element. It didn't kill Homestuck, but it sure as hell didn't help. She's Back has some good character moments and funny scenes despite its atrocious pacing, but Vriska's revival is an anchor around the neck of the comic's last real chapter, dragging it into the abyss. Now then, there is one more suspect to talk about. So far, I've been almost exclusively talking about the comic as a standalone work, ignoring all of the behind-the-scenes drama. And in some ways, that's preferable. I enjoy discussing the themes of Vriska's character arc more than I enjoy talking about people fighting over Vriska on Tumblr. But Homestuck isn't a work that can just be talked about, separate from its relationship with the audience. More and more as the comic went on, the comic became about the fan base and their reaction to the comic. Homestuck is, in many ways, a conversation between Andrew Hussey and their rabid fans. Homestuck's rise in popularity came on the backs of fans, by fans sharing fanfiction and fan trolls and animatics and terrible, terrible memes. Homestuck became popular. The story was shaped heavily in the early days by forum responses, creating this deep connection between the fans and the story. Multiple prominent characters, including the primary antagonist, are parodies of the comic's fans. Homestuck is a comic that could not exist without fan culture. A fan culture so dedicated that it crashed new grounds. A fan culture so in love with Homestuck that they managed to raise more than $2 million for the Hive Swap Kickstarter. That Kickstarter was the biggest mistake Andrew Hussey ever made. Like, to show my hand a bit, the death of Homestuck was not caused by a single decision or moment of bad writing. The comic had problems from day one that only built as time went on. But if there was a single decision to blame, it would absolutely be launching that damn Kickstarter. Bigger than reviving Vriska, or creating the Dancestors, or the Caucasian line, or anything in the epilogues. Creating that Kickstarter was a tremendous fuck-up that played a key part in killing the comic. Now, I get the idea. Andrew Hussey is clearly interested in adventure games, and publishing an official spin-off game probably sounded like a good idea at the time. But, speaking from experience, game development is fucking hard. And Hussey clearly did not have any idea what they were doing. Like, I do not have the time, nor the desire to be sued, required to describe the mismanagement that was that project. But suffice to say, the game was announced with a release date of June 2014, and as of writing, it's still only half completed. Go watch the Sarah Z video if you want the specifics of that project being terribly run. That goodwill I talked about that was the key to the comic's success, taking $2 million from the fans, not releasing the game until years after the comic had ended, and giving little more than radio silence throughout, evaporated most of that goodwill. And although the comic was already fairly dead by the time this happened, not crediting artists who worked on the game and sending legal threats against an essayist who reported on the scandal decimated any remaining affection for Andrew Hussie and what pumpkin that the Homestuck fandom still had. Go watch the other Sarah Z video for that shit. The Kickstarter fiasco didn't just piss off the fanbase, the damage bled back into the actual comic. Homestuck went on lengthy hiatuses so Hussie could work on the game and deal with the legal clusterfuck they walked into. This is a cynical take, but the hiatuses probably hurt the comic more than the frustrations over the delayed game ever did. Fandoms thrive on content, and going from the breakneck pace of the first half of the comic to the admittedly still fast, but definitely slower pace of the second half dried up a lot of the fandom. Parts 1 and 2 took 2.5 years. Parts 3 and 4 took 5 years, with about the same amount of content featuring months-long hiatuses. The fact that the comic's pacing slowed down at the start of Act 6 so we could get a remix of Act 1, and that Act 6 kept jumping back and forth between old characters and new ones, made the comic feel even slower. Having the right pages came out while taking lengthy hiatuses kept the comic from picking up speed again. And this was compounded when Part 4 continued the alternating acts and started with Stardust, a chapter where very little actually happens. To be honest, the speed at which early Homestuck came out was not healthy. I do not know how Andrew Hussie is still alive, because writing that much that fast, to say nothing of the lengthy animations, will kill most artists. That 16-year break shit really isn't funny when you think about it. Honestly, I wonder if the hiatuses were partially an excuse to give Hussie a rest from the comic. The point is, the drama behind Hiveswap, the hiatuses, and Andrew Hussie's general assholitude severely damaged the fanbase that kept Homestuck afloat. I think the comic would have still died regardless, admittedly, but these consecutive stabs compounded the comic's problems. You know, maybe I've been going about this all wrong. What if Homestuck was never good? What if I only liked it because I was 14 and had bad taste? What if Homestuck was always bad and I only started to realize later on because I outgrew the comic and gained the good taste needed to understand that it was bad? Yeah, no, I reread hundreds of pages for this video and I can confidently say that Homestuck was good. The comic's heydays were as good as I remembered. But the comic definitely had a decline. It got worse over time. Part 4, if I am going to be honest, kinda sucks. Stardust is boring and meandering. There's problems and game over are little more than shock value. Fix This is excellent but ends with the worst writing decision in the comic. And She's Back features good character interactions, but it's just good character interactions, horribly paced, without the complexity or sense of dread that the comic perfected in He Is Already Here. There isn't a specific moment that killed Homestuck. Rather, it was a series of problems that built on each other, worsening as time went on. Homestuck always had problems. Bad pacing, an ever-expanding cast, a large portion of whom are undeveloped, plot threads that go nowhere, flat villains, an inability to close out plot points, boring relationship drama, a bigger commitment to being weird and metatextual than to being a good story, characters designed to make the fan base bicker, character arcs that don't really have conclusions. These problems appeared early on, but they worsened as the comic expanded. They worsened as you realized they would never be fixed, like a once benign tumor, now metastasized into a devastating cancer. And then Hussie kills the fanbase by being a jackass, and then the comic goes on hiatus, halting its already sluggish momentum, and then a series of bad writing decisions hit the comic like meteors, slapping the reader in the face and taking them out of the narrative. What these decisions are varies from reader to reader. In case it wasn't obvious, reviving Vriska was that for me. But for other people, it was game over, or the trickster stuff, or the introduction of the nobles, or even the introduction of the trolls. Let me paint you a picture. The comic's problems are festering to the surface, the author's pissing you off, and then something happens that irrevocably damages the comic for you. That is what kills Homestuck. That is what made the comic die. Not because of the slap in the face of a single bad writing decision, but because the slap shakes your system and forces you to look back and see all these problems you've always known but never admitted. There's this really interesting reoccurring theme in Homestuck that I quite like. Characters are often doomed. Because of time travel and non-chronologically synchronous universes and the non-linear narrative, a character will die, then the comic will cut back to before they were dead. And it hangs like a cloud over that character. You sit waiting to see how it happens, when they finally perish. And he is already here. The comic cuts between Jack slaughtering the kids in the present and Jack slaughtering the trolls hours in the future. And to differentiate these time periods, Hussey gave Jack a bloody red hand in the chronologically later scenes. Then, Cascade came and bridged that gap. It showed where Jack got that bloody hand. His hand was stained when he tore out the mayor's stomach. And then the reader realizes, all along, as we saw the mayor befriend the other exiles, build his can town, talk to John, he was always destined to die. We'd already seen his blood. He was dead. We just didn't know it yet. I think that's what the comic was like in the end. It was always going to die. It was unavoidable. The blood was always there, waiting for us to realize who it belonged to. Homestuck's fandom was doomed to collapse eventually. The comic's problems were destined to tear the comic apart. I mean, the metaphor kind of falls apart because the mayor actually survives, but you get my point. The comic was always going to die. Here's the thing about death in Homestuck. Dead characters can still influence the narrative. They can still be important. And perhaps a dead comic can still give a beautiful ending, can still have something amazing to say about destiny and freedom, can still be something I enjoy even after its demise. Homestuck died, but it is still one of my favorite pieces of media. It impacted me as a person and as a writer, for better or for worse. It died somewhere during part 4, but that doesn't mean it was never good, and it doesn't mean there aren't good things in the later chapters of Homestuck. John stumbling upon Homestuck, Dirk staring hopelessly at the devastation as he is consumed by the stardust, Terezi coming up with a brilliant plan before dying spectacularly, Roxy mourning her fallen friends, John playing the wind, Jaspero's annoying Rose, Dave and Dirk's talk on the rooftop, that little moment in Collide where Serenity flies over the injured heroes before reuniting with the mayor, PM overcoming Beck's influence and decking Jade so she can finally defeat Jack Noir, Dave decapitating Dirk and the Jacks, all of the rapture. The dying days of Homestuck gave us the comic's greatest lows, but also some incredible, comic-defining moments. Perhaps that is the note desolation plays, the distant twinkling of life, heard in a world that is dead. Of course, in Homestuck, death is rarely permanent. Sometimes the dead rise, for better or for worse. 3 years after an ending that I personally thought was satisfying, Homestuck came back for an epilogue. Or 2, I guess. And as the guy who waxes philosophically about the comic's themes of narrative, I unfortunately think I am obligated to make a video about the Homestuck epilogues. Ugh.